Revolutionary greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We'd like to welcome everyone that's tuning in on both Facebook Live as well as YouTube to this webcast. And we want to cover today the topic advancing activism and protecting civil liberties uh, during the period of COVID-19, excuse me. And today we have two distinguished comrade organizers, Mark Fancher from the All African People's Revolutionary Party and Jaki Seroke from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. And both of these comrades will be presenting for a few moments on their views in respective to how this is playing out locally where they live and organize, but in the greater African world. And give insight to some of the things that we need to be looking for as a people and as a human community to ensure not only do we keep ourselves safe, our families safe, our community safe, but at the same time, make sure that we do not take our foot off the wheel, off the gas, in regards to advancing revolutionary transformation of our society and the world. And for the All African People's Revolutionary Party, uh, that is um, that is something that we are looking at in regards to our political objective, which is revolutionary Pan-Africanism. So with that said, we would like to um, get going. We invite people to submit questions, comments via the Facebook interface to our Facebook channel, and that's A-APRP, or to the YouTube if you are connected to us on YouTube. And during the discussion, we will attempt to ensure that your questions and comments are addressed and included. So with that said, we would like to start off by introducing our first panelist. And his name is Comrade Mark Fancher. As I mentioned before, he is a longtime organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. At the same time, he is a practicing lawyer, focusing on human rights in the Michigan area of the United States. And he is an author, a blogger, and he's been a great asset to
Looks like Jassy was having some internet issues and was unfortunately disconnected from the call. So Mark Fancher, do you want to, I believe you were the first up. Do you want to begin your remarks?
Yes, thank you very much. And revolutionary greetings to everyone. It's my great pleasure to participate in this program. I want to start out by saying that we're focused on civil liberties. But one important thing to understand about civil liberties is that they are determined by a particular government. A government of one country may have civil liberties that are broader, that are more expansive than the civil liberties of another country, which is why Malcolm X, during his period of struggle, focused not so much on civil rights and civil liberties, because those are determined by governments which are very often oppressive, but he focused on human rights, which transcend national boundaries. These are rights which are universal. These are rights which are God-given. These are rights which governments have no ability to limit, at least not legitimately. And so we have to keep that in mind as we talk about civil liberties. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about civil liberties, it very often, those can be used as an instrument or a weapon or a tool against the people, because civil liberties in the hands of an oppressive government or an oppressive regime can be shaped and modified in such a way that they limit the ability of people who are agitating for justice, people who are agitating for real human rights. It limits their ability to advance their cause. So that is really the purpose of this discussion from my perspective this morning. It is not a discussion where I'm giving you legal advice or trying to explain to you what you can and cannot do, because I'm not really authorized or licensed to do that. That is something that you would have to consult with. You'd have to consult with an attorney in your jurisdiction about those things. But my discussion is to illustrate for you the way in which a system, specifically the capitalist system, will use civil liberties not only for the purposes of controlling people's actions, but also controlling their thoughts, their minds, the way that they proceed with organizing or resisting. My focus obviously is the United States, because that's where I work, where I live. But I think that the experience in the United States is illustrative for purposes of people who may live any place. Wherever you live in the world, you've heard US propaganda, you've heard US rhetoric, and it is always to the tune of, there is no place in the world that is more free than America. There is no place that grants people more liberty, more opportunities to do what they want to do and to say what they want to say than the United States of America. And the presumed protection for that right to speak, the presumed protection for that opportunity to organize and assemble, is found in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that you're free to say anything that you want to say, to do anything that you want to do in order to organize politically. I mean, that's the rhetoric, that's what they say. But the reality is very different. The reality is that the capitalist system has instituted within the context of the First Amendment safeguards. It has available to it mechanisms and methods by which they can curtail the speech, they can curtail the assembly, they can curtail the organizing of people if from the viewpoint of the government, these actions are a threat to the established order, to the status quo. And so we must not organize in such countries with the illusion that we're able to do whatever we want to do, that we can advance revolution without fear or concern that the government is not going to strike back legitimately, at least legitimately from the viewpoint of the existing legal system. But we have to understand those limitations. Just to give you an example of how they do this, they say that you can go out and you can make speeches about whatever you want to make speeches about. You can have rallies and you can have meetings about anything that you want to rally about or have meetings about. But what they also say is that government reserves the right to limit the time, the place, and the manner of those expressions. So if you have strategically determined that it is best for you to have your meeting or to have your rally at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if the government is intent on stopping you from having that meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they can produce some type of a rationale or justification which suggests that they have some significant interest in limiting that or changing that and telling you, no, you can't have it then Maybe it's because at the same time that there's an important meeting on that same street and they're afraid that you're going to make too much noise and you're going to cause a disturbance. Or they can say that this is a quiet community and it's not one where it's appropriate to have this type of demonstration. They can say all kinds of things in order to limit the opportunities to assemble and to do the things that you want to do. And the same goes for where you choose to have your meeting. They can limit that. They can limit the way in which you do it. I mean, we in the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, when we have African Liberation Day commemorations every year, we want very much to have our marches in the street where the people can see us. But the government tells us that we're not allowed to do that. The government tells us that if we're going to have a march, we can only do it on the sidewalk, and we can do it only at a particular time and in a particular way. So these limitations are real, and they have an impact on the ability of people to organize in the way that they want to organize. You know, with respect to this period that we're in, which is a very, very concerning one, the ability of government to step into our lives and to impose restrictions and limitations is even greater, because we're in what's regarded under the law as an emergency. And so what that means is that we are able to only do those things which the government says that we can do in ways that normally we can't. You know, with respect to the rules and regulations that are in place in many states regarding the wearing of face masks, those are things which many people who are privileged think nothing about. They wear the mask, but we who are Africans understand that there's a history, there's a context into which we walk, where the wearing of a mask can produce a fear and a suspicion, particularly among the police, that does not exist for people who may be of a different ethnic or racial background or who have privilege within the society. And so it creates for us additional layers of concern. And it certainly creates concerns with respect to anything that we may want to do in terms of trying to organize. You know, it also has implications for, you know, what we can do with respect to our interactions with law enforcement. Law enforcement during this period of emergency is still the, you know, the police. They're supposed to be the quote unquote civilians who enforce the law. But what has happened is that in many parts of the country, the National Guard military troops have been deployed into many cities, and the purported reason for deploying them is to provide assistance and support in the distribution of materials and material aid, and to provide other humanitarian assistance during a period of crisis and emergency. But if we understand the realities of the capitalist system and how it operates, how it has operated historically, we have to have grave concerns about the possibility that the National Guard is being deployed not simply for humanitarian purposes, but for purposes of maintaining order in the event that people choose to resist the government or the state-imposed rules in ways which they regard as disruptive. Our concern has to be how we as Africans are treated with respect to that, whether there are trumped up reasons, no pun intended, for using military troops to come into our communities and to do things under, you know, the pretext that we are somehow engaged in a riot or a public disturbance. You know, the ability to do that is there if those troops are deployed. In many states right now, there are many white workers who are engaged in public protests, who are complaining about the continuing quarantine rules and regulations that have been in place. They want to go back to work. They want to open up the economy and all of those kinds of things. And some of these demonstrations have been quite militant. The point is not lost on those of us who are conscious that these militant demonstrations by these white workers are tolerated. You know, people look on at these demonstrations and they see how people are standing out there in close proximity, how they're driving their cars onto public government property, how they're doing all kinds of things. And we know We know that if African people tried to have a demonstration like that, those National Guard troops that I just mentioned would come in with a heavy hand. And at the end of the day, there would be many people who are in prison if they're not dead. So we have to be aware of these contradictions, which have racial implications and which have privilege implications with respect to what's happening. We also have to understand the contradictions with respect to how certain populations are treated. They tell us that in order to combat this coronavirus, that it's necessary for us to engage in social distancing. It's necessary for us to keep a distance from each other, that we're supposed to engage in proper hygiene practices and other things. But if you look at where many of African people find themselves during this crisis, you find that many of them are in prisons. And you also find that many of them are lodged in very close quarters. You find that many of them lack access to soap and water on a basis that would be required for them to maintain the necessary hygiene. And so the spread of the virus within these confined spaces is a real threat, if not reality, for many, many, many African people. And when they come out of those prisons and they go into the communities from whence they come, then they have the opportunity to spread it there too. And so with respect to our activism, the focus has to not only be on our ongoing struggle for revolution, but also on our struggle for survival. Because the fact is that maintaining those conditions in the prisons is one which in fact violates the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which translated means cruel and unusual punishment. It also violates the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which refers to the right that people have to due process, which in plain terms means that before you take someone's life, liberty, or property, they have an opportunity to fight back and to defend and to argue against the government doing that. And in the case of prisoners who are confined, in the case of people who live in poverty and who, as in Detroit, where many thousands of people have lost their water service because they can't afford to pay market rate for water, these are people who don't have an opportunity to fight back against an oppressive system that condemns them to conditions which ultimately may lead to their loss of life without due process. So in a nutshell, these are many of the issues that are confronting us at this time. And I assume that if we have opportunities later, we can have a little bit exchange about any particular concerns that people may have. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade. Appreciate the words and the excellent explanation. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if people have comments, questions they want to post to comments and the presentation by one comrade today, or even just something in general to the topic at hand, you can do so via the interface on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can do that as well there. So with that said, we'd like to move on to our second comrade from the Pan-African Congress of Azania, what is known commonly as South Africa. And this comrade's name is Jaki Seroke, who is a political stalwart of the PAC. He's a former political prisoner. He has been active in the underground structures of the PAC going all the way back to 1977. He regularly writes for op-ed pages of newspapers from the Pan-Africanist perspective. He has a blog on Mahimlo News. I think I'm butchering that. My apologies. He can correct that that pronunciation when he starts his presentation. And our comrade actually was in prison, and he had to serve a term for possession of banned literature, which was common during the apartheid era back in 1979. He served a 12-year sentence on the infamous Robben Island maximum prison, security prison, from 1987 for terrorism, so-called terrorism in the language of the apartheid regime, and leading the propaganda section of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, which at that time was still banned by the regime. He was also among the leaders of the PAC that were detained under what was called Section 29 of the Internal Security Act, ironically on African Liberation Day in 1993, 25th of May, 1993, during which the negotiations for the end of apartheid were ongoing. Right now, he is currently the Secretary of Publicity and Information for the Pan-Africanist Congress. He is a book publisher and a strategic management consultant, among his other duties. So at this point in time, let us turn it over to Comrade Jaki Seroke of the PAC.
Thank you very much for making this platform available. And thank you for the good comments coming from the A-APRP, an associate organization that we have all these years worked with, particularly our relationship with the now late Kwame Toure, who has worked very well with our comrades who were in Guinea-Conakry at the time, trading and so on. So it's a revolutionary friendship that has a relationship that goes many years back, and I think it will continue doing so going forward. I'd like to thank you, comrades, for making the discussion in the way in which we have set it up, so that we discuss issues that are common among ourselves. The situation in the United States of America for Africans there is a mirror image of what you have in occupied South Africa. Despite the fact that we have a constitutional democracy in South Africa, we still have our land, the land of the indigenous people, occupied by interest of whites. The discussions and negotiation settlement that took place in South Africa only provided a human rights culture, but denied the people what is fundamental in a revolution, and that is the land. I should highlight that there's a property clause in the Constitution that identifies property that was usurped by the colonial settlers as a legitimate right for them to that property. So that clause in the Constitution actually takes and negates everything else that has been achieved in the struggles of the people against apartheid and settler colonialism. But this is an agreement that was made against the best advice of all other revolutionaries by people that are looked upon throughout the world as icons of the struggle, and people who have served time with us on Robben Island, like Nelson Mandela and his cohorts. They agreed to this, obviously thinking that every revolution must be taken on a gradual stand, but the commitments were such that they make settler colonialism legitimate. Now, the conditions that we find ourselves in today with the spread of COVID-19 clearly demonstrate the disparity between the dispossessed and the landlords, the people who own property. It also clearly shows the differences between people who are suffering from engineered poverty who are the bottom of the pyramid in society, simply because of their history and where they come from. And these are the African people. We have a complex situation that has arisen out of this give and take deals behind smokes and mirrors that were made at what is known as CODESA, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, that the international community supported here. In effect, the international community was not aware that they were supporting. I don't think, even if they were aware, there's an argument for that. They were not aware that they have isolated African people in Africa who are in South Africa away from getting their right to self-determination. Even the condition of human rights that we're discussing today, where we have the freedom, the Bill of Rights, and all the basic freedoms to express ourselves, to associate with any political organization that you like, or any social organization and that you want to associate with. All of those rights put together have undermined the right to self-determination that all the people who occupy a historical place in the world have a right to. And this is because the South Africa of the past, or South Africa before the constitution that was made, the interim constitution that was made in 1993 and further adopted in 1996, that constitution was based on the understanding that South Africa had all along been an independent country. Independent because of its history, where the British colonialists and a section of the Dutch people who had been driven from Europe out of religious wars and so on, and driven to what was regarded as a safe haven in Southern Africa. They put themselves together as the Dutch, the Boers, as we directly called, had a fight. They set up a guerrilla warfare against the British imperialists after mineral resources and everything else were found in Southern Africa. And out of that, they formed a union. Out of the war between the British and the Boers, they formed a union and called it the Union of South Africa, and took 4 republics that were established and put them into one, and made South Africa what it is right now. But that union established the Bantustans and took a majority of people into 13% of the land. That 13% of the land still continues right now, and it has been made legitimate by the processes of negotiations, which in real terms are a sellout negotiation in Kempton Park. So now, today, when we have the spread of COVID-19, people are expected, it's in South Africa, whilst it is not a fully fledged state of emergency, the country has been put under a national state of disaster. And they've used this platform because the impending disaster was the pandemic, and that it must be kept. We all agree that the pandemic must be stopped. But in doing that, the rights to move, the rights to have been suppressed. People must be locked down in their houses. Now, this is not actually possible for the majority of the people, because the people do not have adequate shelter. They do not have enough to eat. They live from hand to mouth, from day to day, without anything whatsoever to sustain them. South Africa's inequality is a ticking time bomb. You have almost 18 million people who depend on grants, who today need food parcels to be able to survive because they cannot afford to be kept in the areas where they live. People who live in slum areas, and there's a lot of slum areas in South Africa, cannot afford to stay in a tin shack in the heat of the sun, the blazing sun, during the day. So they walk out, they're just forced to walk out. And what we've seen as a result of that is police and army brutality, because they stop people on the road and make them do extreme exercises that they do in the army, such that there has been one victim in a slum area called Alexandra Township. So we have a twin area of oppression, the fear of the spread of coronavirus that the community is engaged with, and the reality that people cannot be able to fight hunger, poverty, and inequality at the same time. So things, South Africa is bursting at the seams, because those who are put in positions where they cannot be able to look after themselves have to move into the streets. And there has been many reports in parts of South Africa, from Cape Town up to Durban and Johannesburg. These are the epicenters of this area, of this novel coronavirus, where people just cannot afford to be indoors, like the well-to-do who have adequate housing are doing. And there are many other people who live in the rural areas in greater numbers who are not reported upon. So it means, in effect, that the pandemic has raised a very core issue of the contradictions in South Africa that continue to be. And the contradictions are really that the condition of settler colonialism has not been resolved. They have left it intact and brought in its place what is basically a human rights culture. The human rights culture is also faulty because it does not take primarily the issue of the rights of the people to self-determination. So our leadership, our rights to, our birthright to the land of our forefathers has not been resolved. So the inadequate existence between the colonized and the colonized continues, because in a settler colony, these are the complexities we have to work with. We cannot expect that our colonizers should go back to their motherland, because they've been here for several generations, and yet they still hold the trappings of power. They still hold economic power. They still hold power in the judiciary, because most of the laws has been made by them. So this inadequacy means that we have a government that is unable to, no matter how they wish, to fulfill the needs of the masses. They get a mandate every year, but cannot be able to fulfill that mandate. That system is very dangerous, and is going to continue to create problems for the country. What we have in the form of the ANC is that this year, from January of this year and in February, the leadership of the country has been very inadequate and unable to resolve its own problems. The economy South Africa was actually in a deep recession for the second time, which means we had an economy that was almost about to collapse, and has given the ANC, the ruling party, which is known for talking left and walking right, the opportunity to reaffirm itself with the disaster management rules, because no activist can take up public platform. Communities cannot meet. We cannot have ordinary marches. We cannot be able to voice ourselves. Even the commercial press, the media on the whole, is only focused on the COVID-19 as an issue of the day. So no other news are coming up. What have we done as revolutionaries who understand the context of the area we live in? We have from a position of weakness, have moved from that to unify our forces inside our Pan-Africanist forces on a principle of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, on the principle of putting first our need to serve the people and to take a position of suffering that is at the level of the majority of the people I'm talking about and express their views, so that we express the views of the majority of the people. We have done this internally inside the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania to unite all the forces that are able to unite. We have been wrecked previously, and we must be able to say this from the outset, that we have been wrecked by successive generations of leaders in the PAC, some who do not understand, some who are occupied with careerism, and to take whatever crumbs that are put for public political systems, like being a member of parliament and getting all the benefits that go with that as careerists, rather than looking after the people. And all these things have created a lot of problems inside the PAC in the past 25 years or so. While looking at that and have made serious self-criticism of ourselves on that basis and said we must follow the ideals of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, himself a university lecturer who committed class suicide and decided that the PAC's leadership will be in the hands of the literate, the semi-literate, and the illiterate. In a political language, he was saying the Pan-Africanist Congress will be led by the workers and the poor peasants. It will be led by the ideology of those people because they hold a position that when they have nothing to lose when the struggle for change takes place, but only their chains. They have nothing to lose but to gain access to their land, to gain access to controlling the hand, rather than to a petty bourgeois leadership that is easily bought over, captured, and used by the enemies of the people, as we've seen in the instance of the current regime that is ruling right now. There are also problems within that ruling party currently, because some elements have seen their ways about, and also that Nelson Mandela is no longer there. His influence and himself as a factor no longer applies, and they are now fighting what they call white monopoly capitalism. So the forces of revolution have an opportunity to come together, but the first hurdle is to go through over this pandemic. And the pandemic will be stressed because under these conditions, the revolutionaries will not be able to meet. The revolutionaries will not be able to organize properly because there are restrictions on what they can do and what they cannot do. And these conditions also offer the transnationals, the corporate, the big corporates, an opportunity to assert themselves in the economy, because the big fish will eat the small fish. So these small businesses that are in danger right now will be completely obliterated, and a new form of trading will take place. But the big business will be calling the shot, and they're doing this by rushing to say they are offering. In the case of the Oppenheimers, they said they are offering R1 billion to the pandemic, but in reality, they are not offering R1 billion for free. They are setting up their own company to give people, small companies, loans and so on. So they set the tone. They know exactly what they will be doing in changing, because as you know, in the debate between the economic base and the political infrastructure, if the economic base is held by the imperialists, no matter how clever the politicians are that you put in power. They will not be able to do anything because the reins are held by those who have the dollar in their hands. So in South Africa, we're facing these challenges. And the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, is analyzing this situation all the time. And we're placing ourselves in a position where we will be able to truly reflect the feelings, the voices, the way in which the masses, the Azanian masses, see themselves achieving victory. It's back to the drawing board. It offers us an opportunity to review, to analyze, and to unite the revolutionary forces and to put our views in the public. To do this, we're now using modern platforms. We're using digital platforms to present our voice. And we have done this in the past 30 days of the lockdown. We have been able as the PAC to issue almost on a regular basis our own viewpoints and our own relationship with the masses. And we have the initial response we get are from younger people, the generation that led the Fees Must Fall movement. This is the generation that looks at Pan-Africanism as their saving grace. This is the generation that has seen that we live in sellout conditions that have been agreed upon at CODESA. This is a generation of people who come from broken families, who are unable to get into university colleges and so on to gain knowledge, and they know that the only thing they can do is go to the streets. And the PAC, with its advanced political knowledge and advanced understanding and its experience in the revolution, is now properly situated to lead that revolution in a united front with most other forces that can be united against this. It is really unfortunate, and we have to emphasize the point that the coronavirus pandemic will hit hard at communities of the poor. It will hit hard at communities that I've explained earlier, who do not have access to healthcare, who do not have access to sanitation, who cannot be expected to have a hygiene, and who are squashed together in very small places. So, and with underlying illnesses, we have almost 7 million people who are still living with HIV pandemic. Our people, the African people, are really placed at a point where, should the pandemic spread, we will be its serious victims. We are aware of that. That is why we are taking a position where we say, despite the fact that we have critical points against the government, people should comply with the need to look after themselves, to wash their hands and so on. But we are concerned with the spread of the virus, and we have to be compassionate and deal with these issues as they come. And we are mobilizing our people, because people cannot just sit in the house when there's no food. So we do support people with whatever little food that we can, so that people can be able to look after themselves. So I'm in conclusion saying that as more as things change, they remain the same. This condition in racist South Africa that we had before apartheid was dismantled still continues today. The same thing applies in Southern Africa. We have governments that are illegitimate, that have lost it and do not have the support of the masses with them. We have all those type of governments who run a kind of dictatorship because they are controlled directly by foreign powers, by the U.S. State Department, by the British, by There are former colonizers who dictate the terms, and so those governments are made weak. So our struggle is against imperialism. Our struggle is against rampant capitalism. Our struggle is for us to stand on our own and make Africa unite and become a powerhouse in the world as it used to be long ago. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you for your comments. And in the few minutes that we have left, we want to bring a few questions to the both of you. The first question that was presented on Facebook was for Comrade Mark Fancher. And the question is, for those of us who are or have lost loved ones that are concerned, that are condemned, to conditions that do not allow due process, how do we fight for them? And that's the question to Comrade Mark.
Well, there are a couple of different levels of struggle that I think that are involved here. With respect to the loss of individuals, members of families, and for that we feel great sympathy and great sorrow. The circumstances of their deaths will dictate any potential legal claims that might be available for a cause of action or a claim that's called wrongful death. And that's something that you would have to discuss with an attorney to determine whether that is something that's available as a remedy for the family, as a way of receiving some type of compensation for the very, very, very tragic circumstances of the person's demise. But on a broader level, I think that we owe it to all of those who have suffered infection and death as a result of this to intensify our struggle for revolution. Because the fact is that this pandemic is really the consequence of a capitalist system which has not had the best interests of the masses of the people at heart. Healthcare is a human right. That's something that should be guaranteed to everybody. Access to healthcare and good health, nutrition, water, all of the things that are necessary to prevent the spread of disease. But because a capitalist system is greedy and it wants to put the wealth of the nation in the hands of a few, it privatizes healthcare in capitalist countries. It takes it away from the government and puts it in the hands of people whose only interest is profit, increasing the amount of money that they put in their pockets. And if that's what drives them, then they're going to shortchange the quality and the extent of the service that's available to the people. And so you have situations like this, where in a country like the United States, which is supposed to be the wealthiest in the world, it doesn't have the resources and the capacity and the ability to address the basic health needs of the people. It does not have the capacity and the ability to predict the occurrence of this virus. You contrast that with Cuba, a socialist country, which is not only addressing its problems with respect to healthcare and which has always guaranteed healthcare to its people free of charge. It's not only addressing its own problems, it's sending brigades of doctors into other countries that need help and assistance. So in the name of those people who have lost their lives, we have to commit ourselves to ensuring that we bring about a different type of a world, a socialist world, where the needs of everybody are addressed so that we don't have these kinds of situations that get completely out of hand simply because a system allows greedy people to gobble up the resources and to limit the opportunities that people have to address their most basic needs.
Thank you for that. A question to Comrade Seroke, and it is in regards to, is there any specific legislation that is being put forth in the South African or Azanian parliament that appears to seek to consolidate power among the elites and to further limit civil liberties even thereafter, once I guess once the actual pandemic has been overcome. And is there anything that the organized African revolutionaries can do to get ahead of that situation or that legislation?
Now, in response to that, the South African constitutions, the executive has all the powers to run government, as we all know. They also have the power to go to the IMF and strike some deals and explain later to the National Assembly, which is the parliament. So the executive can only be answerable to the constitutional court if they have crossed boundaries. But what they have done is, instead of making a state of emergency, which will give them all the powers. This is the question you are asking. They don't have a state of emergency yet, but if they have a state of emergency, then they will collapse all the avenues and all the recourse that people have to fight government, to be able to include reactionary positions or fascist dictatorship laws as they see fit. But we don't have that yet. Everything has to go through the courts because there are checks and balances to see to it that government, the executive in government is looked at. But right now we have a state of disaster, and the executive calls the shots. It only has to liaise with political parties by informing them of what they do. But in the past 15 days, we've had exactly what the question is asking for. The executive can decide as they wish. They can go into arrangement and deals without talking to everyone and explain it later. So this is really depends on the nature of the deal that government will make with outsiders. We're either messy. Thanks.
Okay. One other question that I actually have for the both of you, and you both alluded to it a bit in your presentations, but from the perspective of Pan-African revolutionaries, how can we get ahead of this situation, or what opportunities specifically to organize and mobilize our people in specific ways, if any, you all think that are presented as opportunities to organize our community based on the experience that the masses have gone through with this pandemic, whether it's organizing locally, whether it's organizing on a broader scale. What opportunities do you all think are presented to our people to move us forward based on what has happened in the last 4 or 5 months?
Well, I can say that in the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, we use dialectical analysis. We see that there's positive and negative in everything. With respect to this pandemic, it is overwhelmingly negative. But if there's anything positive that comes out of it, it is the fact that it has exposed, in a way that has not been apparent for most people in a very long time, the stark contradictions that exist with respect to the capitalist system and its frailty, its inability to provide for the needs of the people. And for those of us who are organizing, now is the time to point out those contradictions, to show the ways in which the capitalist system is not only inadequate, but it's vicious. It leaves in its wake a line of bodies, people who die because of what it is all about. So now is the time to push that. And for those of us who are Africans, we have to take a cue from what we see in Cuba. I mentioned just a moment ago the fact that Cuba is able to send doctors outside of the country to help other people. This is a little tiny island, a little tiny country that's able to do that because it has a socialist system. Can you imagine what an African continent, an entire continent, united and socialist, liberated from the forces of capitalism and imperialism, would be able to do? I mean, if Cuba can do that, imagine what a liberated and socialist Africa could do if it's united. And so it is a cue for us to fight even harder for Pan-Africanism, to throw the capitalists and the imperialists out of Africa, to unite Africa and to institute socialism in Africa so that it not only is able to help itself, but it's able to help everybody in the African world, wherever they may live on the planet. We should draw inspiration from that, and we should understand that this is the moment, this is the opportunity, one that we've not had before, and one which may not come again for quite some time.
Yeah. In Azania, I think we have an advantage in that the Azanian masses often have the ability to rise up, even if it's spontaneous. Our people know oppression, dispossession, and they can react to these things on their own. Our difficulty has been really a leadership. Our problems have always been in leadership, where people with colonial mentality often coming to the rescue of the capitalist and the imperialist. The masses, if they are organized properly by their vanguard revolutionary ideology, and they are made to understand, in this case, the path that revolutionaries, Pan-Africanists are taking, and that it will liberate almost every one of them and put them on a better footing. And if we organize regularly on the ground and work with the masses, I think we have a better chance of overturning things in the favor of the African people. I also think that because we are not as organized as we should be, because there should be a network and a regular communication between us and our people, us and our fraternal friends throughout the world, just to show that this is not a narrowly focused instance of bread on the table on a day-to-day basis, but it includes people on a worldwide basis. If we continue with political education and so on, I think we would go miles ahead. And we have to change that, because if we don't, what dominates is the views of the imperialists more than anything else. So we must overthrow that domination, that white domination that continues to persist in South Africa.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I know we're at the top of the hour. I wanted to ask there maybe 2 more questions, if you all have maybe 5 minutes to address, comrades.
Sure.
Yes, that's
so one question I think is specifically for Comrade Mark Fancher. What are our rights to refuse mandatory vaccination, which has been a pretty significant topic of discussion, not only in North America, but in other parts of the world as well, the African world specifically?
Well, you know, as I've said, I cannot give legal advice, you know, because very often the answer to these types of questions depends on very, very specific factual circumstances that that confront individuals. And it also very often depends upon laws which govern a particular jurisdiction. So I cannot provide a blanket answer to that that's accurate and that you should rely on. But what I can say is that during a period of emergency, the power of the state expands. They are able to do things that they normally might not be able to do. So in times when there has not been a declaration of a public emergency, you know, you can make your own decisions about whether you want to get a flu shot or whether you don't want to get a flu shot. But things change when there's a declaration of an emergency. And so, you know, what you might normally be able to do, you may not be able to do now, at least under the law. So I think if there is a particular concern, then you do have to consult with an attorney to determine whether for some reason you're exempt from any you know, mandates which are coming from state or federal government. But things are different now, and you don't have the same freedoms and liberties that you might ordinarily have.
But there are also patients' rights. You know, patients have a right to, and I know the rights are limited. There are these limitations to rights that may be implemented in cases of emergency. But a patient could possibly refuse to be used as guinea pig for a vaccine that has not been proven, and simply refuse to be treated that way. It's an extreme case, and one would not advise people to take a position like that until they're very clear that they do not want to go through, for either religious or whatever reasons, not to go through what is regarded as mandatory vaccine.
Okay, so the last question, and we'll close out and let you all get to the rest of your respective days. And thank you again for your time today. The question is, well, it's a two-part question, but I think part of it has partially been answered by both, but if you want to elaborate on it a bit more, you can. Is the Pan-Africanist Congress and the All-African People's Revolutionary Party working with other Pan-African organizations to struggle for Pan-Africanism on the ground? That's part one. And then part two, how can we push nations to look beyond their own borders to address COVID-19 and other critical challenges in Africa?
Well, the answer with respect to the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, to whether we work with other organizations, is a resounding yes. That is one of the primary tasks that our organization sees in trying to carry out the directions that were given by Kwame Nkrumah, who is responsible in large part for our ideology. So organizations like the Pan-Africanist Congress and others which share our objectives, you know, we try and to have very active engagement with and work with them on the ground, you know, as well as in other places and spaces. In addition to that, we also have alliances with organizations that are not African, but which are, you know, also committed to building a socialist world, and which in their own ways are struggling with the same types of issues that we deal with. These include Palestinians, these include the indigenous nations of the Americas, these include even the Irish, who are fighting against British imperialism. And so we work with them as well. You know, this is a priority task for the organization. With respect to pressuring nations to look beyond their borders, you know, we see all of this is bound up as part of the same struggle. You can't go to whatever government you're governed by and, you know, as a member of a powerless group or a powerless community, require them to do anything. They'll laugh at you. So we say that that's the value of organization, particularly global organization, Pan-Africanism. The more organized we are, the more powerful we are, the more we are in a position to actually make the kinds of demands that will produce results. when we achieve Pan-Africanism, when we have one unified socialist Africa, this will be a question that we won't even raise. Because if we just act in the least bit irritated about anything, every country in the world will be jumping to find out why we're irritated and bending over backwards, jumping through hoops to try and make what we want happen. So power is what matters. And power for us as Africans comes from one liberated, unified Africa under scientific socialism. And that's the objective of the All African People's Revolutionary Party.
I agree, and I think you've said a mouthful, because that internationalist perspective is very important for revolutionaries to adapt and to put into practice, so that we can assert our voice again and be able to bring back almost everyone who belongs to a group of revolutionaries. Well, since the introduction of what is known as globalization has put in one perspective rather than a multilateral perspective on the unity of peoples against imperialism. It's very important for us to unite. And I think that one of the measures that should be taken is to try and unite the peoples of Africa through various levels, whether it is through cultural activity, exchanges, of almost everything in their daily life, from education to everything. But all these activities must be revolutionary in content. If we do that transformation, then real change will happen. I think that in Africa, the colonial borders must be dismantled. We all agree that this is what should happen, because it's not right to have people of the same language being divided by a border. These are the problems. That's why you find people who are always in conflict with the authorities, because they are displaced on the basis of these machinations of the imperialists. So we have no other choice but to unite and to work together as a people.
Excellent. Thank you all again. I think with that said, we want to respect our comrades' time. It's pretty late in Azania. Was it six at night there? We thank you, Comrade Soroke, for taking out this time to give us a little bit of insight on what's going on in Azania, and also the perspective of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, as well as our comrade Mark Fancher from the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We thank you for your contributions as well. We thank you for the questions and comments. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to every single one. But hopefully we can continue this process in the coming weeks and months, as we have a number of online events and dialogues coming up, and those can be accessed as far as the information on the All African People's Revolutionary Party website, on our events page, as well as our various social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So I think with that, we will close out for today. Thank you all for your time, for your participation, and let's move to organize our people for one unified socialist Africa and for a greater and more humanistic world society. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Isolate.